Hi, my name is Eamon Fogarty from Brookland Computer Services, and I'm here today to talk to you about GDPR, General Data Protection Regulations, coming into force in May 2018. I'll start by saying the future ain't what it used to be, and I think that's very important in business. Things change all the time, and we must change with them, we must evolve all the time, and regulation is part of that evolution. Particularly this piece of legislation, because it's got some very interesting commercial pressures built into it that we'll talk about a little bit later, but it makes it important that people do conform to it and move forward in a new way of respecting personal data. Before we get into the legislation itself, I would like to add this one, because I think it's very true. There are three types of companies. There are those that make things happen, those that watch things happen, and those that wonder what the hell happened. And unfortunately, experience in recent months with GDPR is showing there's an awful lot of companies that are going to be saying, what the hell happened? So let's move into it. Let's look at the legislation that is trying not to be one of those companies. GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation. It's a European-wide piece of legislation that is there to safeguard the personal data of all European subjects, no matter where in the world they are. So if you as a business are anywhere in the world, you've got to follow the General Data Protection Regulations if you're dealing with personal data of European subjects. It is almost impossible to conduct business these days without dealing with people from every continent. So this is a piece of legislation that doesn't just affect Europe, but affects the globe. GDPR focuses on some key areas, and these are the three key areas it focuses on. Data storage and transfer, how we handle, manage, transfer, share data. The data subject rights, and this is the core of it. The rights those data subjects have to have their data treated with respect and treated with transparency and lawfulness. And accountability and governance. Who's responsible? Not just the organisation, but also the individuals within that organisation who have to take responsibility for how their organisation behaves with personal data. What is personal data? Because GDPR only relates to personal data, but personal data is anything that identifies an individual. So it starts with things like your name and address, but will also include your social security number, the IP number of your home computer, tracking information on your mobile phone, the registration number of your car, your job title, your work email, or just any fact about you that makes you unique. They will identify an individual and therefore are considered personal data. This legislation applies to all personal data. Now we think primarily in the digital arena, but it also applies to physical, paper-based information. So as we go through this today, yes, the digital is important because that's the area where there's the greatest scope for abuse or the greatest scope for data theft or data loss. But there's also, it applies equally to paper-based records. So just keep that in mind. For this slide, we're going to look at 8 rights of the data subject. Now, it's almost certain you watching this are a data subject, so these are your rights. So for this slide, forget about your corporate responsibilities and think for a moment just about an individual. It's the best way to understand these 8 rights. You have the right to be informed. When somebody collects your data, you have a right to be told why they're collecting it, what they're going to do with it, who they're going to share it with, why they want it, and how long they're going to keep it. You have a right of access. You can ask any organisation to tell you what data they hold on you, and they must tell you. They normally have to do so within 28 days. There are occasions when they can take longer in certain circumstances. But in general, they have to tell you and not charge you, because it's your data. You have a right of rectification. If the data they're holding is incorrect, you can make them aware of this. They can validate the facts, they can check your identity, but in the end, if the data they hold is incorrect, they must correct it. You have a right of erasure. Now, this is a complex one, because yes, you have a right of erasure, providing the reason they're holding your data is because you give permission. And we'll talk about that a little later on. So it's not as broad as it might seem, but where the right of erasure might not apply, or the right to be forgotten, it's also been known as, the right to restrict will apply. You can say to somebody, okay, you've got a good reason to hold my data, a lawful reason to hold my data, but you can only use it for that lawful reason. You cannot use it for other purposes. You have a right of portability. If you want to move your data from one organisation to another, they must cooperate with you in that move. Now, we've already seen this in the banks over recent years. The UK banks have worked out a way to help you transfer your account. So now if you move, the two banks cooperate. They handle your standing orders, your direct debits. Even monies that are paid into the old account will automatically be forwarded to the new one for you. This is they, as institutions, cooperating to give you the power as an individual to be able to move from one institution to another. And this is what we're all expected to do with personal data. You have a right to object. Every organisation who handles personal data has to put in place a process and procedure to facilitate an objection or a complaint, and you've got to handle that correctly and professionally. And you have a right to profiling. If your data is being used to profile or make automated decisions, you have a right to understand how that's being used and what data is being used to do it. The best example of this is, historically, we went to get credit or a loan. We sat in front of somebody, we answered all their questions, they punched them in the computer, and then they said, the computer says no. And that was the end of the conversation. In future, you can say, whoa, I want to know how the computer reached that decision, what logic it used, what data it used to reach a decision. And that way, if there's something wrong, you can have it corrected, back to your right of correction. But it doesn't mean you'll get credit you're not entitled to, but it does mean you'll have a transparent process about how your data is handled. So they are your rights, and you can enjoy those, and they are a benefit to you. But of course, we also have to consider how we, in business, facilitate that for all the other data subjects out there. So let's talk for a moment about two terms that will come up repeatedly here: data controllers and data processors. And you're probably thinking, which am I? Well, chances are you're both, and you're sometimes both simultaneously. So the simple way to understand this is that if you take data and you decide what to do with it, you're almost certainly a data controller. If you are given data by a data controller and instructed what to do with it, you're probably a data processor. And most organizations are both. This legislation has built a very, very clever twist which binds these together. I can sometimes refer to as a double bind. This is because the controller is responsible to make sure that the processor is acting lawfully. So if you take data, you share it with somebody else, it is your responsibility to make sure that they act lawfully. The processor has an obligation to ensure that his data controller is acting lawfully, and should only take data and process it from a controller who is acting lawfully. So this double bind is what's going to create a commercial pressure for people to follow these rules, because you will find, as other organizations implement the rules and look at their partners, they're going to decide they only want to trade with people who are also following the rules, because otherwise there's a liability risk coming back onto them. So initially people will continue with important suppliers, important partners, but over time, if those partners don't comply, they will look to move to partners who do. And I think this will make the legislation universal, and I think even beyond Europe within a few years. Let's look at 7 key principles of GDPR. So what do you have to think about when you're dealing with data? You should only collect data in a lawful, fair and transparent manner. You should have a legal basis, and we'll talk about that later. You should be fair about what you're doing. So it's not just a question of is it legal, but is it fair as well? And you should be transparent. You should tell people what you're collecting, why you're collecting, and what you're going to do with it. Who you're going to share it with, how long you're going to keep it. You should only use it for the purposes you told them you were going to use it for. You cannot then decide to use it for something else. You should only collect the minimum amount of data that's required to fulfill the purpose. So don't collect other information just in case. You can go back and get it later, or very often in the past we've collected data we didn't need. You have a duty to keep that data accurate. I don't think this extends to you becoming a private detective and going out there searching for changes, but if you could reasonably know that those changes would occur, then you're expected to have a method to update your own information. And if it's brought to your attention or reported to you that the data has changed, then you have a duty to update your copy. You have to look at data retention. All data you keep, you should only keep it for as long as is reasonably necessary, and that you have, again back to this phrase, a lawful basis for. Now, this doesn't mean that all data has to be kept short term. You can keep data for decades, as long as you have a good reason for keeping it. A typical example is a mail order company where I ordered something, they delivered it to me 5 years ago. Have they still got my records? And if they have, why? So you have to look at that. It's all about the risks and the reasons. You have to look at integrity. Are you keeping that data safe? Are you protecting it from theft? Are you protecting it from unwanted manipulation that might harm the data subject? And who's accountable? Not just the organisation, but individuals within the organisation who have to be responsible for how you as an entity behave. Right, let's look at lawful basis, because I've referred to it a number of times, and it is very important to get your head around this to implement the GDPR correctly. I have listed consent at the top of my list. However, we'll set that aside for a second. I'll put it there because everybody else does, and it's the first thing people expect to see on this slide. But it is actually a very weak reason for most businesses. It totally empowers the subject, not the business. So you should first look and see, have you got other bases that you should be using. One of the common ones is the performance of contract. This is very common in B2B, but also in B2C. If you're performing a contract, then you're entitled to hold the data that is reasonably necessary, and for as long as it's reasonably necessary, to fulfill that contract. And you do not need to seek additional permission to hold that data. You can also hold data for the compliance with a legal obligation. So if you're required by law to hold data, which many professions are, whether that's your doctor, your accountant, your lawyer, your financial advisor, if they are compelled by legislation to hold data, then they don't need to ask your permission for it. They can hold that data. They can only use it for the purposes that they have a legal reason, but they can hold it and use it for those reasons without seeking permission. The protection of the vital interests of a data subject. So in many cases, same people I've just listed will be holding data for your protection. You don't want your bank account to be lost because your bank deleted all your data. If you get a tax inquiry, you want to be able to go back to your accountant and ask them to give you other copies of records. If you have a medical problem, you expect that your GP still has your records so that this can be looked into, or the hospital that did the work for you still has your records. So in many cases, data is held for protection of the data subject. But again, like before, it can only be used if that's the reason you're holding it, that's the only reason you can use it. You can't suddenly decide that it's useful for other purposes and get on and use it that way. The next two are ones that I find of less use in the area I tend to work, which tends to be in the commercial sector. I think these relate a little bit more to public bodies, but this is in the overall public interest or in the execution of official authority vested. So again, if they involve you, they're well looking into, but I find in many cases they're not as relevant. The last one on this list, legitimate interest, is a very powerful, very broad clause that I think is going to be greatly abused. It's also a complex clause. So I'm not going to go into it in depth in this presentation, but I think I will probably do a separate one that covers it, but if not, people can approach me. I'm happy to give out papers. We can put some papers on our website that actually talk about that subject. What you need to know for now really is, if you're trying to carry out, usually a marketing exercise, trying to carry out something where you want to reach out and contact people, but it doesn't seem to qualify under any of the other bases, then it's worth talking to a professional to see can they help you make a case for legitimate interest. And you may be able to go ahead and reach out because it's in the interest of your organisation and or the interest of the data subject themselves. This brings me back to the one I set aside at the top, which was consent. Consent is very powerful, but it can be withdrawn at any time. So if you ask somebody, and we're excluding children and vulnerable people from this, but if you ask somebody for permission to do something that's reasonable and lawful, then you can go ahead and do it. And this is very common basis for marketing, for sending out extra information about products, for inviting people to events, etc. But you must be aware that there are certain conditions around how you get that, and it can be withdrawn at any time. The conditions around getting lawful consent is as follows. You must demonstrate when and where you got that consent. It must be clearly distinguishable. When you ask that question for consent, it must be a clear, distinguishable question, not buried in terms and conditions, not buried in small print. It must be easily accessible. You must be able to reproduce this. You will find that you will be asked to do so. So it's important you keep those records and you can show the language used and the location and time you got it. You must use clear and plain language when you're asking for permission, so that the data subject can understand what they've been asked for. You must explain to them at the same time as they give permission that they have the right to withdraw it at any time. And you must make it easy for them to withdraw it. Consent must be freely given. It cannot be tied in with other things in an unreasonable manner. So if you buy goods, there's no way people have to say, well, you must tick this box to allow us to send you your goods and market to you. No, they must separate those out. They can ask you if they can send marketing information, but they cannot force you to consent just so you can get your goods. It would not be valid consent. And very important, if you break these rules, then you lose consent. Now that may seem fair and obvious, but it's important. Very, very good example would be in group companies, where one company in the group has a mailing list that people have subscribed to and want the information, and they're sending out that information. A sister company somewhere else says, it would be great if I could send to that list, so the first company shares it. Well, now there's an infringement by sharing it, because the original consent we're going to assume was never given for the second company as well. But also the first company, for having broken the rules, now loses its consent. And it's not just as easy as write out again and ask. So it's important that if you've got consent, that you show respect for that consent and only use it in the way it was given to you. Let's look at 14 key areas that we say are good ways to get ready for GDPR. Look at your privacy governance. Document your risk assessment, assign privacy roles and responsibilities. Look at your data inventory. Where do you store data? List out the personal data you have and look at the data flows through the business. Look at your privacy policy. This is an important document. This is your public statement about what data you collect, why you collect it, what you do with it, who you share it with, how long you keep it. So make sure that that is accurate and it reflects what you actually do in the business. Have a collection and consent policy. So how do you collect data? Under what lawful basis are you collecting it? And if consent is required, make sure you have a proper consent form and a process for people to update or ask to have their data erased. Training and awareness. All staff who handle personal data should be trained on GDPR. Now, that is most people in the business. It's very difficult to work today in any capacity and not handle personal data. So that really boils down to everybody in your business needs to be trained. The training can be proportionate to their role, and in some cases that may be fairly limited training required, but everybody needs training. Security and risk assessment. Look at the security of your data, physical data and electronic data, and think, is it appropriate for the type of data you're handling? So maybe you're just handling names and addresses because you're a logistics operation. Maybe you're handling medical information. Maybe you're handling important financial information. So make sure your security is appropriate to what you're handling and that you have processes in place and the staff are educated. Look at your third-party risks. We talked earlier about how the controller and the processor are locked together. Well, therefore, everybody you share data with is a potential risk to you if they're not acting lawfully. So if you're sharing highly sensitive data, it may be appropriate to go to their business and audit them. But in most cases, it's not. In most cases, it'll involve sending them a questionnaire, asking them about their readiness for GDPR, have they got certain policies and processes in place, you making sure you've got a written agreement with them that stipulates clearly what data they're to process and how they're to process it. That is a requirement. Look at your privacy notices. Make sure that everywhere you collect data that you are telling people what you're doing with it and why. Have a process for requests and complaints. People want to request a copy of their data, they want to complain how you're handling their data, they just want to talk about how you're handling their data. Make sure you've got the processes there to help them through that, because it is their data and you're merely a custodian of it. There's a phrase used quite a lot in legislation about privacy by design. And what this talks about is that everything you do in process and policies and the way you operate in business should take into consideration privacy right from the beginning. So it should not be an afterthought. It's a bit like a building site. It's important that health and safety is considered before ever a worker sets foot on the site or ever a brick is laid. It's the same way with data. Before you ever take somebody's data, you should already have considered how that might impact their privacy. You need a policy for breach management and a process to follow if there is a data breach. I think it's important that this is communicated well to key staff and that the policy itself is kept a copy off your main IT system. Because if you've got a data breach, one of the actions you may need to take is to shut down access to your core IT system, in which case, how do your own staff get access to the plan to know what to do next? Look at your data handling practices. Do you take files home? Do you have data out of the office on laptops, on mobiles? Do you share data with other organizations? Look at how that data is handled, and is there appropriate security with it when it is handled. Is your data security and risk mitigation appropriate? Have you got the security that matches the type of data? And have you done all the little things you can to control risk, everything from education to using encryption if appropriate? And finally, do a gap analysis. Look at how you're doing things, look at the data you hold, and decide whether you are compliant, and if you're not compliant, where are you not, where can you improve, and document that. The ICO are looking for transparency here, looking for people to acknowledge where they've got weaknesses or problems and to address that. So in those cases, they want you to have a plan in place, even if that's going to take time. For example, if you need to replace your CRM system to give you the flexibility that you might need going forward, then you can do that, but you can only do that over time. That might take a year to do. Fine, you've identified it and you've taken whatever steps you can to mitigate the risks between now and the time you complete that plan. And that's the kind of transparency they're looking for. I'm going to say thank you for bearing with the last few slides, and this one in particular. There's quite a lot of information on it. We're now going to do a little bit of a recap with this. Look at your security of processing. Look at your breach identification. Can you identify if there is a breach in your security of processing? Have you got security? Have you got the correct confidentiality and integrity there? Look at regulator notification. It's very important that if you have a data breach that you notify the ICO within 72 hours. And that 72 hours is critical. That's important for your organisation and for the individual as well, who can be held responsible if they deliberately bury or ignore that deadline. You don't have to have all this information. It's great if you have, but if all you're telling them is, look, we think we had a data breach, we think this is the rough nature of it, and we're investigating, that still meets your 72-hour requirement. So don't ignore that deadline on the thinking, well, tomorrow I'll have more information. And if the data breach is significant, then you need to tell the data subject, and you need to help them mitigate any risk around that breach. So it's important you notify them quickly, and therefore it's important that within your plan you've worked out how you would notify them if need be. Okay, that covers the core of GDPR. Let's look at a couple of quick reminders that may be useful to you. I like to look at it sometimes this way. Think about, what do we have? What data do we have? Where do we hold it? Who's responsible for it? Where is it saved? Is it in the cloud? Is it on local servers? Who's got access to it? Where are the touch points? Where does it come and go in the organisation? How do we transmit that data? Is there security on that transmission, and is that security appropriate to the type of data? What third parties do we share it with? And do we only share the data we need to? And again, have we got written contracts with those third parties? Is it clear in those what their responsibilities around data processing are? What is our lawful basis? In other words, why do we hold it? Have we established a clear lawful basis for each piece of data? Now, sometimes you'll have multiple lawful bases that could apply to a particular piece of data, and sometimes you'll have a given subject's data in which different lawful bases apply to different parts of that data. Both of those are fine, but you need to identify what basis does apply to each type of data, and you cannot just change this at will. So the ICO do not want to see you saying it's consent today, contract tomorrow, and best interest of the data subject the day after. You can of course change your lawful basis if circumstances change, either your circumstances in the business or the data subject circumstances, or a combination of. So that's absolutely fine to review it and change it on that basis, or even to review it if there's certain guidance come out from the ICO. But you cannot chop and change for your own sake. And then look at your IT. Is it secure? Is it appropriate for the kind of data you're handling? We'll talk a little bit more about IT security in a couple of minutes. I'd like now just to mention some of the things we do, and this is, if you work with us, it's how we would approach it, but it's also a process you can look at internally and you can take on board yourself. We want to understand a little bit about your organisation, so we have sort of a preparation where we want to know about you and the type of data you hold. That bit you probably don't need to do. We do an awareness and gap analysis. This involves taking training to all of the business. We think something like a couple of hours training for everybody in the business, so that people are aware of what's happening, why it's happening, why they're being asked to make changes, and they understand the principles behind the new legislation. Because even if you forget some of the detail, if you remember the principles, there's a good chance you're going to act correctly. It also means that people who think you're passing down rules for arbitrary reasons don't follow them. If people understand why these new rules are coming in, then they will be more inclined to follow them and comply with what the business needs, and you'll get a much smoother outcome. We then do a gap analysis where we look at the business, we look at across 140 points, others may look at slightly more, slightly less, where we look at whether you're compliant, partly compliant, whether there's challenges in those areas, whether it's something you're doing that's perfectly correct, and all you need to do is document it. So we go through that with you, we produce a gap analysis, we produce an action plan that lists the things you need to do, and we produce a comprehensive toolkit that guides you through that action plan. A total report is probably likely to be in excess of 100 pages, but it's not meant to be read like a novel, it's meant to be used as a reference material. So you can work through that manual and implement GDPR. If you want, we're happy to come in, sit with you and help you write the policies and processes, but it must be us helping you. It must not be you handing it over to us. Because if we produce a manual and parachute it in, you won't follow it. And it won't reflect how that business works, and it won't reflect the ethos and principles within that business. So it's useful to have somebody support you, but it must be your creation, and that way it reflects your business and how you actually deal with data. When we're going through it, like I said a moment ago, we look at 140 points. Most of them are policy and process related. The grey area here is more technology related, but it's very important you recognise that GDPR is more of a policy and process and attitude and training than it is technology. We produce reports that are colour coded and give you graphs to help you understand where the most of the work needs to be done, where the areas of greatest risk lie. So that pretty much covers GDPR. If you're happy to bear with me a couple of minutes more, we're just going to look very briefly at some areas around cybersecurity, because this impacts very closely with GDPR, and while I am adamant it's not an IT problem in GDPR, it's an overall business, IT have a strong part to play. So let's look at some risk and cybersecurity frameworks. There are many out there, and you as an organisation may already have things like ISO qualifications, in which case, or certifications, in which case that's great. But if you haven't, then I recommend a good starting point for a lot of businesses is Cyber Essentials. It's a very basic government supported incentive that has 51 points you're asked to comply with, and they're very practical and simple. They're not aspirational and policy driven, they're practical. Do you have a firewall? Have you changed the password from the manufacturer's default? Does everybody have their own log on to the IT? Do you have logging enabled so you can know what people did when they were on the IT? Do you update machines regularly? Do you have antivirus in place? Do you have mobile device management if need be for mobile phones and tablets? So it's practical questions that your IT guy, department or outsourced company can easily handle. And it's a great framework. Even if you don't go for certification, it's a fantastic checklist. But I also got to say, it's not all about technology. It's not all about what your IT department can do. The people and the processes are important. And when we look at security these days, we find that people are the largest risk. Gone are the days when firewalls were easy to break through and IT was easy to hack. Yeah, it's still possible for some hackers, but a lot of it these days is it's the way they send you emails. They get you to do it for them. So it's training people and putting support processes around those people that help to improve your security. We see fraudulent emails, we see spyware and malware, we see impersonations, people writing to your accounts department pretending to be one of your own senior executives. Well, it's important that the culture in your business says that anybody who's suspicious can question and check. If that means that the new person in 2 weeks in your accounts department has to phone up your FD to say, did you actually send me this instruction? Then the culture should be that's the right thing to do. And nobody's going to get in trouble for checking. But people should get in trouble for this. And this still goes on today. People writing on yellow stickies or pink stickies or blue stickies, I don't mind, but you shouldn't be writing down your passwords. This is the type of thing that thieves love. Or, better still, choose one of these passwords. They can guess those very easily. They'll run automated programs that can guess thousands of the most popular, not just these few. But don't pick easy passwords. And the other hint I'll give, don't use the same password in multiple places. Because if it does get compromised in one place, then it gives somebody access to your entire work. And that's for your personal stuff, not just your business. If you're holding important or sensitive data, then consider two-factor authentication. I wouldn't bank with an organisation today that gave me only a username and password to log on. And you look around you, HMRC, DVLA, your mobile phone company probably send you codes to help you log in at certain times. They're implementing security, to guard personal data, and if you're handling sensitive data, you should be doing the same thing. Look at web filtering control. This is not just there to stop people wasting company time and browsing websites. This is to protect them. Where they get lured to websites, they either look like legitimate sites or they click through on them from an email. The software can recognize these corrupt sites and will block access to them, thereby protecting the individual and protecting you as an organization. Look at application whitelisting. This is where you take away from the average user the ability to install software. He can only run the software that's been pre-approved by the business. Now, in most businesses, it is only the IT guys that install software these days. So, by taking away the user's rights, you're probably not doing him any harm. What you're doing is you're stopping the criminal who lures that individual from inheriting rights that can allow them to install software. And that's one of the things they really want to do. So, your chances are you're doing no disadvantage to the user himself, but you're giving him a lot of protection. I'm not even going to discuss this one. You should have anti-phishing, antivirus, and anti-malware. And all I will say is make sure that they're up to date, that you have a central monitor that tells you that they all are up to date, and that they include phones, tablets, and portable computers, as well as home computers used to access company data. Whoever owns them doesn't matter, you need protection on them. Look at anti-spam. Your email system can almost certainly implement this for you remotely and can cut out a huge percentage. We look here at Brookland, where we do this for a lot of clients, and we are discarding in the low 80% terms of all email that comes through our system. So that's the amount of junk that's out there. Protect your users from that, it cuts down the risk. Look at mobile device management. I go into so many organizations where I still see people collecting email on mobile phones with no security, very often personal mobile phones with no security. If you're going to have corporate data on the mobile device, you need to have corporate security on the device. I don't think there's any way around that. If the user doesn't want to accept it, then you have to decide as a business whether you provide them with a mobile device so they can use their email, or whether they need to use their email when they're out of the office. But either way, it is your data, and if it gets stolen, and it will if it's on mobile phones, and there's no way to wipe those phones or trace those phones, then you're going to be reporting a data breach, and it's going to be your responsibility. And I don't think there's any choice in that. Finally, I'm going to say thank you. Thank you for watching this. I hope you found it of benefit, and I'm going to wish you a really, really good day, and hopefully I'll see you soon. Bye.